Welcome back to the channel Book Dragons. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I recently finished reading The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. This is the final book in Mistborn Era 2. And I am here to tell you why I think you should read Mistborn Era 2. Now, I do have to make a disclaimer here. You absolutely must read Mistborn Era 1 before you start reading Mistborn Era 2. There is so much background that you are going to miss if you start reading Mistborn Era 2 first. So I would recommend, if you haven't read it, you need to read it first. Now, this video is not going to be a spoiler-filled review. I'm going to do my very best to keep it spoiler-free. If some minor spoilers leak in, though, you haven't read Mistborn Era 1, so you should probably do that. So if you have read Mistborn Era 1, you are completely safe to watch this video. I'm going to do my very best not to spoil anything from this series, okay? So if you're worried about spoilers at all, you need to step away, go read those books, and then earmark my video to watch at a later time. You know, if you have a separate folder that you're like, oh, I keep all of my videos that I need to go back to at some point in the future in this folder, do that with this video, please. Because I do want you to watch it, but if you're worried about spoilers, I totally get it. Okay, all of the disclaimers out of the way, I'm going to assume you're okay with continuing forward, and we're going to talk about this. I was very leery going into this series for a couple of reasons. First being that I liked Mistborn Era 1, but I did not love it. In fact, the last two books were just kind of iffy for me. The second book especially, I didn't really care for that much. The ending was great. And then the final book, Hero of Ages, was really pretty good, but then the ending just kind of was weird for me. So Mistborn Era 1 is kind of mixed for me, and I also did not think that I would like a flintlock fantasy. I don't have a lot of experience with flintlock fantasies, but I've had enough interactions with them to know that it doesn't really sound like my cup of tea. But I wanted to read more Mistborn so I would be caught up with the Cosmere. That's one of my long-term goals, is to make sure I'm caught up to date with the Cosmere. So I went into Mistborn Era 2 with low expectations. And man, guys, this series for me was so much better than Mistborn Era 1. It really was. This is set about, I think, 300-ish years after the end of Mistborn Era 1, and we are embarking into the industrial age. So they're just starting to learn about certain technologies like electricity and automobiles, and it even delves into a little bit of steampunk because you've got airships and stuff like that. And so it's a completely new era, new setting for Scadrial, which is the planet that Mistborn takes place on. It's one of the planets in the Cosmere. I was really impressed with how this was pulled off. I find that I get really into that particular time period for some reason. Turn of the century, industrial age, things are just starting to happen with technology. It's just a really, really cool time. And yet you still got that old era type of feel where you've got people still dressing in their fancy attire. You know, they've got their frock coats and their walking sticks, and in the case of Mistborn, it's dueling canes. So they carry around dueling canes, and that's one of the ways that they battle. And so that's really cool. The first one was kind of set in more of like a Victorian Renaissance-y type of setting, and now we're getting into the industrial age. Think late 1800s, early 1900s if you're comparing it to the world we live in. And as I mentioned, it is a flintlock fantasy, so they do have guns. And this takes on the mantle of a buddy cop, police procedural type of adventure. And adventure is definitely the right word for it. So, in the first book, it's kind of in this old Wild West setting almost, where you've got Wax and his partner Wayne out in the roughs, rounding up hooligans and bad guys and trying to solve a deeper mystery around this mysterious group that is causing problems. And then the story and the world just expands from there. So so if you like that type of thing, you like buddy cop and you like police procedurals, high stakes adventure, there were times that it almost felt like Indiana Jones mixed in with that as well, which I love, because one particular book, there's a whole focus on treasure hunting. It is just so much fun. And these are fast-paced books. So Mistborn Era 1 was kind of slow-paced. It had action-packed moments, but there were moments where, at least for me, it dragged. This series did not drag at all for me. It's very fast-paced. They're very quick reads. I think the longest it took me to read one of the books was a week and a half. For most of them, it was less than that. And very quick reads. So the pacing is really good. The characters are fantastic. So the main characters in this story are Waxillium Ladrian and Wayne. I don't remember if we ever got Wayne's last name, but Wayne is just Wayne. And you're just going to have to be okay with that. And they are what's known as twinborns. So they have a mixture of both the powers of allomancy and feruchemy. Allomancy is essentially the ability to ingest metals, and the different metals that you ingest do different things depending on the way they interact with your body. And most people can only do one or at the most two metals, and that's the case with everybody in this world, at least right at the beginning. And then feruchemists can store different abilities in their metal mines, and so these are just little metal drums that are either attached to their body or in some cases embedded under their skin surgically, and they can store different abilities like making yourself lighter or heavier or things like that. So the magic is really, really cool, and Wax and Wayne are both twinborns, and this is new for Mistborn Era 2. So I'm not going to explain the differences because I don't want to spoil Mistborn Era 1 for you, but just know it is a new take on an old magic system. And in this story, people with the abilities to do these things are known as metalborn. So they're born with these abilities, and Wax and Wayne use them to take down corruption and solve mysteries and things like that. It's really, really cool the way it's done. And one thing I really love about Wax and Wayne is all the witty banter that they engage in throughout the books. Wayne is definitely a unique character, and a lot of times what turns a lot of people off from this story is that they don't like Wayne. I absolutely loved Wayne. He was the best part of this series, I think. His humor was just perfect for me. I laughed out loud so many times. This guy is just an absolute riot. So if you read this series, just know that you'll have to decide for yourself if you like Wayne's sense of humor, but I absolutely love it. And he is especially adept at dialects. And he loves to wear hats, and I love to wear hats. And depending on the hat he puts on, he feels differently and can perform certain dialects. He'll be like, you know, I think I need to work on that dialect. Let me see if I can get a hat that fits with that. It's a riot. Wayne is just absolutely a superb character. He made the series for me. There were a lot of great things about this series, but he made the series for me. So there are also other characters in the story, such as Marasi Combs and Steris, and I forget her name as her last name as well. But anyway, they are half siblings, and they're just a lot of fun. I loved all the unique takes on those characters, and there are Khandra in this series, and if you're not familiar with Khandra, they are unique beings that can take on the form of pretty much any human or animal in this world. So they, as you can imagine, they can be easily disguised. And the way it is used in this story is great. The Khandra in this story are just absolutely amazing. One of the Khandra in particular is seen at one point in the story trying to buy someone else's bones for after they're dead. You know, I want to buy your bones off of you. Can you will those to me after you're dead? It's so absolutely hilarious, so funny. So I loved the characters in this story. Religion plays a fairly big deal in this story as well. There is a sect called the Church of the Survivor. There is also a sect that worships Harmony, who is the main deity and ascended being on this particular planet. And there's more lore around that as well, and it would spoil the ending of Mistborn Era 1, so I'm not going to do that to you. Just know that you're going to get a lot of information about not only Scadrial and what happened at the end of the first era of Mistborn, but you're going to get information about other worlds as well. Not so much in the first 3 books. The first 3 books are really mainly focused on Scadrial, but then as you move on into the final book, into the Lost Metal, there are a lot of crossovers with other stories in the Cosmere. So the Lost Metal is the most Cosmere heavy of the books, and there are going to be things that may be spoilery for you if you haven't at least read Mistborn Era 1 and at least have some familiarity with the Stormlight Archive. Just keep that in mind when you're going into this series. Once you get to the final book, you may want to have read some of those other stories in the Cosmere. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about what I liked about the story, although I've given you a pretty good idea already of what I really liked. I absolutely loved the setting of this story in a more turn-of-the-century industrial setting with a little bit of Wild West flaked in there as well. That was really excellently done, and I loved the characters. I mean all of the characters. There wasn't one character in this story that I did not love. They were so perfectly executed, in my personal opinion. Other people will disagree, and that's completely fine. I get it. This is just my opinion, but I absolutely loved the characters and thought they were executed well. The plots of each of the books were bangers, guys. I was on the edge of my seat so much throughout this series. There was not one book in this series that I felt dragged or didn't capture my attention. I just felt like I was completely and totally invested in the stories that these were trying to tell. And maybe it was things like some of the mystery elements and some of the treasure hunting elements and different things. There was so much variety, and the politics were handled really well in the story. I just thought it worked together so wonderfully. And even though you've got a world that is just budding into the technological era, there is still plenty of room for the magic to be central to the story. And I thought the way that he changed his magic system and kind of morphed it to fit this new era was perfectly done. I really, really do. It just worked for me. So what didn't I like, or what would be some potential cons for the story? I can only really think of 2. The first one is kind of what I talked about, that it's very Cosmere heavy at the end. So you really do have some prerequisite reading to get into this series. At the very least, Mistborn Era 1, and probably Stormlight as well, toward the end of the series, Lost Metal specifically. I would recommend reading the Stormlight Archive. You don't have to, but you're going to be kind of confused with some things at the end if you haven't familiarized yourself a little bit with the Stormlight Archive. So, just a suggestion. Brandon Sanderson himself is a big proponent of start wherever you want. I don't totally agree, but it's okay. You do what you want. This series is a fantastic read. The only other thing that I would say is a potential con is that some of the terms used in this particular setting are very familiar to what we commonly talk about in our world. It does kind of take you out of the story because you're like, couldn't he have made up a word to use in place of that to kind of keep within the setting that this is a fictional novel? It's fine. It's not that big a deal, but there were some times where he was talking about cars, right? And he mentions petrol, and I'm like, really? Couldn't you come up with a different word for it, or but it's okay. He didn't want to reinvent the wheel, no pun intended. So that's okay with me, but it did slightly take me out of it, but not enough to ruin my experience. And so I guess that's where I'll get to now, is my ranking for the series. And I would rank this series in the soaring category. Absolutely no question about it. This goes in my soaring tier. I just had a blast reading this series. And I'm going to say right now, without a shadow of a doubt, this is my favorite series that Brandon Sanderson has written. Yep, you heard it right. This is his best series, in my opinion. I like the Stormlight Archive. Don't get me wrong. It's a great series. But certain books in that series didn't totally work for me. And I'm just blown away by how consistently good this series was for me. It just worked on every level. So this is my favorite Brandon Sanderson series that he has written. And I can't wait to continue the Cosmere. I am currently reading Mistborn Secret History. That is the only Cosmere story that I have not read yet. And I didn't read it specifically because I know that it spoils part of Mistborn Era 2. So I wanted to read Mistborn Era 2 first, and then read Secret History. And I'm so glad I did. I might talk about that particular story in the future, but this is focused on Mistborn Era 2, and I absolutely loved it, guys. So let me know in the comments below what you thought about Mistborn Era 2 if you've read it, and what you think about Mistborn Era 2 now. If you haven't read it, are you going to read it? Is it higher up on your list? Have you read Mistborn Era 1? What did you think about that? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please dialogue with me in the comments. And guys, until next time, make sure you're reading more books, and I'll talk to you soon. I'd like to take this opportunity to shout out my patrons. I really appreciate all the support you give me, and I'm just so thankful for you.